So this is the Financial Times series on President's muscular foreign policy has left Ankara more isolated and angered NATO allies. This is a completely stupid and untruthful and dishonest heading, as is the content in the copy, because if Erdogan is accused, as the Financial Times accuses him of following a policy that alienates some of the other countries, then the same kind of allegations and criticisms could be applied to almost all the regional kind of powers concerned, including Israel. Now, Erdogan's personality is not any different from the personality of the Israeli prime ministers, the series of them, and most certainly not that of the current incumbent in the post of Prime Minister of Israel. Nor is Erdogan any different from the Italian neo-fascists. And most certainly, Erdogan is not worse. In fact, he is not as bad as some of the Eastern European heads of state. So what is the Financial Times' problem? The problem is not contained in the evidence that the Financial Times actually relates to or refers to. The problem is the agenda against a Muslim country being significantly established in government, and that is the whole problem. And for example, the evidence that the Financial Times mentions reads ridiculously common. Mr. Erdogan, who most analysts believe wants to remain in power for as long as possible, has used foreign policy for domestic political gain. And then it goes on to accuse him of comparing the German government to the Nazis and advising French President Emmanuel Macron to seek mental treatment. Now, these are not given the contextual detail. Macron was not only in need of mental treatment, but he was being condemned in far worse terms by ordinary Muslims across the many Muslim countries, including Muslims in Bangladesh, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Pakistan, and in India. So Erdogan is not doing anything really exceptional, especially not exceptionally uncommon. He's doing something that is felt. He said whatever he said about Macron as an anti-Muslim and racist, that is commonly accepted by the vast majority of observers, that Macron is hostile to Muslims and is a racist. As for the German government, that is obviously the Nazis were in control of Germany. So the issue of comparing the government fronted by Angela Merkel with the Nazis is complicated and needs detailed examination. Whether Angela Merkel can be said to be following anything the Nazis did needs to be very strongly and seriously examined. At this moment, we don't have any evidence of that. But what we do have evidence of is that German society, politically, socially, and culturally, is as anti-Muslim as the rest of the Western European countries. And especially after the fact of the Muslims being found to have been more cooperative and cohesive in terms of contributing to German society. The persistence of racist, anti-Muslim activities in Germany has to be examined by looking at the role of the government fronted by Angela Merkel, whether they are committed to really dealing with those anti-Muslim racists or not. As for the blame for Turkish hopes of joining the EU fading, as the Financial Times says, this is again a stupid kind of statement by the Financial Times. As I said in part A today, Turkey would not be joining the EU for decades, not because Turkey cannot be a functioning member of the EU, but because of the hostility based on anti-Muslim hatred and prejudice and the Crusader agenda that persists across Western Europe to this day. So, as I have no brief for Erdogan or for any other head of state or any other regime, my observation and comment are entirely based on the evidence before me and accessible to me. And on the evidence available today, the Financial Times is totally wrong. And the Financial Times is being kind of capitulating to Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab as compared to its attitude of hostility towards Ankara. Now, today's newspaper, which boasts of being the newspaper of the year, journalism you can trust, it says that vaccine drive for UK is failing to hit the target. And they're running a headline or a heading under the title of Monarchy and calling Sarah, Andrew's ex-wife, as HRH Sylvie Green. Duchess launches new career as a romantic novelist. Sarah Ferguson is apparently now writing books as a romantic writer. And this is a very interesting piece about MPs have been reprimanded for asking staff to travel to work in Westminster despite the lockdown and Tier 3 and Tier 4 rules in place over recent months. Now that gives the game away. MPs are criminals and liars and morons, all of these things in various orders based on the evidence. And they are saying that Kamala Harris says that we are better than this, and they will be elaborating on this in a long piece in the newspaper on Thursday. And the business section of the Boris graph is saying that abrupt end to stamp duty holiday will crash market. And they're running a campaign apparently saying that stamp out the stamp duty. The stamp duty is the tax that is required of housing market. And again, this is a wrong campaign. It is not about housing. It's about housing as market. It's not about housing rights. And there are assorted other market-based items promoting the market idea, not rights, let alone the needs of people. And we have absolutely no evidence that today's Fleet Street contents contain anything different from the role that the Fleet Street papers play in hiding the truth, in denying the truth, and in suppressing the truth, and in misleading people, and not complying with the requirements, the basic requirements of journalism that the so-called students of journalism are taught. What, where, when, why, etc. There is nothing like that. It's all packs and packs and packs of propaganda. It's not the fact, it's not the evidence. And all the headlines are propaganda headlines, and they're not actually reporting the truth. They're hiding the truth. They're covering up the truth. And we have no reason to believe that the newspapers or the mainstream media, the Fleet Street papers or the broadcasting counterparts will change the course or the role or the line or the narrative in the foreseeable future. Meaning foreseeable future, meaning years or decades or even longer. And the fact that the newspapers are actually shrinking in terms of circulation is directly related to the fact that they don't tell the truth. And locally, the lying role played by the archant or the archanted titles circulating in the name of the East London areas, for example, the Newham Recorder, the Docklands and Tower Hamlets, or East London and Docklands Advertiser, or Docklands and East London Advertiser, whatever the title. I'm not looking at it this minute. But it used to be the East London Advertiser, which our movement has been calling East London Idiotizer for nearly 30 years now, because of the idiotizing role of the contents. The Newham Recorder, the East London Idiotizer, and the Hackney Gazette, these are all owned by the Archant Group. And the Archant Group is a self-confessed group of liars, as they admitted, as their so-called digital content editor executive person said that the newspapers, the so-called local newspapers, don't have an automatic right to be allowed to continue in publication if they don't actually attract the readers. And it is further confirmed by the fact that they have been running for the last 2 years, or just longer than 2 years, an online appeal for readers or people who view them to make contributions to them for their survival. And it is absolutely stark. The woman who is apparently the editor of the two titles, the Neom Recorder and the East London Idiotizer, Leslie Jones or something, is so stupid that she equates journalism and authenticity and accuracy with somebody being called a journalist on one of their titles. No amount of superior research, empirical, ethical, evidential, corroborated materials constitutes journalism to her. So that is stupid beyond condemnation. And it is like the likes of her that have actually lowered any relevance that these titles, so-called, might have had in the past. To the local people, the local communities. And there is no evidence that the titles actually want to tell the so-called readers or the advertisers the truth about what the local councils are doing. At no level of the facts and the evidence affecting people's daily lives, evidence of the behavior of the local councils, elected councillors, does the title in each of the borough or each of the boroughs actually relate to what is going on? And what is going on in terms of the broadly divided areas include housing, include schools and schooling, include health, public safety, and the environment. And in none of the areas has any of these local papers been reporting even 1% of the activities that are actually taking place by individuals confronting, encountering the local council and the wrongdoers. Individuals as recipients of the wrong decisions, the illegal decisions, the prejudiced decisions, the criminally intended wrongful decisions and negligence. This is in the numbers is like in the three boroughs, let's say the three boroughs that are kind of lumbered with the elected mayor post of corruption, Hackney, Newham and Tower Hamlets, the three boroughs put together will have at least 100,000 people aggrieved with the three councils' behavior. And there is nothing in the councils' structures that allow any reasonable process of auditing the behavior of the criminals. The criminally intended crooks that are in posts in these councils as employees of the council, the in-house employees. And the same applies to the outside, the external contractees that these councils engage and hire from time to time and on contractual basis to carry out some of the routine works that the councils are supposed to be responsible for. And there is nothing externally. That is to say, there is no judicial kind of remedy. As I said before, not today, but on previous occasions, And as is the case, wrongful decisions by local councils cannot be really effectively kind of challenged by the targets of the wrongful decisions. The only thing that is available is a further time-wasting diversion called the local government ombudsman, which is ridiculously, uselessly irrelevant. It takes time and it doesn't acknowledge receipt of complaints, and when it does, it doesn't uphold the complaints. By any standard of evidence, as based on the, let's say, standards of objectively kind of established evidence, followed, say, in 5 or 6 different jurisdictions, the evidence submitted to the local ombudsman is dismissed irrationally. And the same applies to the courts of so-called courts of law. And the substantial forum that is in theory available is the High Court, Queen's Bench Division, which we mentioned in the previous part A. Queen's Bench Division is where applications, listen to this, applications seeking permission to apply for judicial review. Application seeking permission to apply for judicial review of executive action. Now that gives the game away. That means that a person who has been victimized by or attacked by the wrongful decision of the executive action can spend the rest of their lives pursuing that application process. It's a nightmare. So what exists in Britain, so-called civilized country, mother of parliament and democracy, and the assumption, the myth of all of that, perpetuated by the liars called Fleet Street, is the culture, is the reality that is comparable to that film, The Prisoner. The Prisoner, the film, which featured Patrick McGoohan, whose refrain was, "I am not a number." It is the same kind of fate, horrifying and horrible perpetuation of denial and obstruction and lying that is inflicted on the victims of the intentional criminality and lying by the local councils in East London. And this can be extrapolated to apply to other councils in other parts of London and England and in the UK. As we said before, not today, but in previous parts and broadcasts, the Private Eye magazine runs a page called Rotten Boroughs Column. It is supposedly based on the corruption, incompetence, waste of money, etc. by local borough councils. But it doesn't cover, that is to say, it doesn't actually report even 5% of the corruption and criminality that goes on. And there is no case, as far as I can remember, based on decades of studying this page and this column, there is no case that has been effectively brought through the court system bureaucracy holding a single crook councillor or crooked mayor, holding them to account. Hasn't happened. And the main reason why it hasn't happened is because despite the fact that they call it, the Private Eye call it, rotten boroughs, they really don't publish most of the truth about the rottenness and the criminality and the big criminality, the big crimes that go on. So it is in context of that we mention the fact that the Private Eye, the same magazine, also claims to run a section, it's longer than the Rotten Boroughs page, called Street of Shame. Remember the name? Fleet Street. We call it Fleet Street. Most of the informed people call it Fleet Street, but Private Eye goes one further and calls it Street of Shame. We could go even 2 stages further and call it Street of Criminality and Crime and Racism and all the other things. But just looking at the Street of Shame name, Private Eye runs a regular column fortnightly, because Private Eye is, what we call it private lie, but again, in the case of, just like we said about the Murdoch, Dirty Digger Murdoch owned controlled scum, we call it Private Eye when we actually mean to call it private lies and private lie. So the Private Eye, which comes out every fortnight, it's not a weekly paper, it's not a daily paper, it's a fortnightly magazine. And it runs that section called Street of Shame. The name suggests that they are exposing shameful behavior by various Fleet Street papers and their various employees, journalists, editors, whatever, owners. But a close, long read over decades will show that they are just tempering, and they are doing even less than tickling. They're doing less than tickling because they don't actually go into the agenda being pursued by the owners, the agenda and the narrative being pursued by the journalists, so-called, the agenda and the narrative being pursued by the editors and the controlling decision makers. And the reason why they don't do that, they don't go into examining, let alone reporting, let alone exposing the occurrences of the corrupt, racist, and criminally in denial policies of these titles, Fleet Street titles, because private lie itself belongs in the same culture, belongs in the same attitude. So what they're doing is tinkering with the surface. That is just touching, modestly touching. They are not exposing anyone seriously. And again, after studying this section for decades, I cannot see any instance. There is no instance, including during the Levison inquiry. We'll come to that in a minute. Including the various references to Dirty Digger Murdoch, who owns the Times and the Sun, Scum, and the News of the Screws, which was the News of the World, which he was forced to close down as a direct response to the charges against the title over the murder of a white girl by a criminal based on allegations of her phone being kind of abused, and also other allegations. During the Levison inquiry into the Fleet Street and into the misuse of the Fleet Street papers, Private Eye made several allegations based on published statements. Especially Private Eye made allegations. They were not original. They were actually stated to the Levison inquiry by witnesses, so-called. The allegations were recycled, let's say. and they concern the behavior of Rebecca Brooks. Now, Rebecca Brooks is one of the world's most highly paid women media executives. And it is a mystery to this day as to why Rupert Murdoch pays Rebecca Brooks so much money as he does. And so, despite the fact that they make a lot of noise in terms of their references to Rebecca Brooks and the references to Rupert Murdoch, whom they call Dirty Digger, and we use that by acknowledging the fact that they coined the word or phrase Dirty Digger Murdoch. Despite the fact that they actually make a lot of references to Rupert Murdoch, the Sun, the Scum, and other titles in Fleet Street, which they call collectively the Street of Shame, there has been no successful court case against any of them. In fact, when the libel award to Jeffrey Archer was made based on the various things that were alleged, Jeffrey Archer got a big libel win, and then he was actually exposed as a liar, as a result of which perjury he went to jail. But it was not anything to do with the coverage and the contents of the reporting by Private Eye, either in the Street of Shame or in any other part of the magazine. So when that series of libel cases and reversals took place, Ian Pissoff, in other words, Ian Hislop, whose name I have edited as Pissoff, going back 30 years or more, or just about 30 years, I think, in public. Ian Pissoff appeared on TV screens and standing as he was filmed outside the High Court. And he expressed the angriest criticism against the libel law and the libel court system. And he was part of the rest of the Street of Shame in criticizing the amount of money paid for libel to claimants against newspapers, doing libels against the claimants. And Archer at the time was a claimant, successful claimant. So Private Eye and Ian Pissoff played the same role, followed the same narrative, made the same argument as the rest of the Street of Shame. Now that is a proof. That's not a speculation. That is based on evidence. And Ian Pissoff, to this day, is boastful of the role he played and the part he played in bringing about an end to the regime that existed up to that time of litigants bringing defamation action, getting high sums of money awarded to them and against their defamers and libelers. And that is the position currently. And this position is bad because libel has effectively been abolished, or the remedy of defamation has been abolished for most of the people who are not billionaires. Nobody has pointed this out, but that is what has happened. Because you have to prove that you have actually suffered actual damage by the particular defamation you have been caused. Now, that is not possible. The attack on the integrity and reputation of a person cannot be calculated in money terms, in terms of relating the two together, the correlation between the actual libel and any actual damage is impossible. So the only successful way that a libel action against a libeler can be brought in a sustained way is when and where and if the libeled person or the defamed person has got limitless amounts of money to pay the licensed law traders and carry on arguing at the most superficial, up to the most superficial level of the arguments, and they can get remedies, which is what is happening now. As it happened in the case of the wife of the previous Speaker of the House of Commons, Sally Barco, being sued by a billionaire. And the High Court, the Queen's Bench Division, awarded the billionaire a victorious kind of ruling against Sally Barco. Now the winner, who is dead now, the winner never, McAlpine didn't need the money. And he didn't have to prove that he had actually suffered actual damage as a result of Sally Barco's alleged libel of him. And so the victory was in principle a victory for McAlpine and a loss and a defeat for Sally Barco. Now, Sally Barco's libel or defamation was very, very tenuous, very thin. It was 1/1000th of a percent libelous of McAlpine. But McAlpine's lawyers and the corrupt High Court allowed that to be expanded into something very serious and very damaging to McAlpine. Indeed, it wasn't. Sally Barco only tweeted, "Why is he trending on Twitter? Why is McAlpine trending?" That's all she said. She did not call him any offender. She did not call him a liar. She did not call him anything, which is what is called against the many thousands of people defamed and libeled since the 2013 Defamation Act was brought into being as a direct result of the pro-defamation campaign that Ian Pissoff appeared in. So the myth that private lie diagnoses or dissects or truthfully examines Fleet Street is a myth, is a criminally intended lie and a perpetuation of Fleet Street's own lies and lying. None of the serious issues, including poverty, hunger, starvation, or the mass murders of the most vulnerable people by the DWP, which withheld their benefits, thus forcing them to commit suicide, as part of the agenda devised by Ian Dracula Duncan Smith and others. None of those things has been examined evidentially or investigated by the private lie. And the costs to people affected by the libels and defamation and the other lies by Fleet Street continue to mount and continue to be incurred without any remedy. Now, it is still the case as I speak, and I speak on Wednesday, the 13th of January 2021. After years of publishing, Private Lie does not carry anywhere near reasonable, rational, accessible kind of contents about the courts of law. Even when Paul Foot, whom we have discussed and identified as a racist, even when Paul Foot was involved in writing some of the pieces in Private Lie, and especially when he single-handedly carried on running short pieces about Girpal Vardi. Now, Girpal Vardi is a man of the Sikh faith, S-I-K-H, Sikh faith, who was a metropolitan policeman. And he was framed by other metropolitan police persons. So his case became several cases, and Girpal Vardi is no longer a police person, but he's still around and still kind of partially interested in some of the things that his cases illustrated and contained. So even when Paul Foot was reporting about Girpal Vardi, his reports were not complete or full, not about either about the Metropolitan Police, either about how the Metropolitan Police is operated, and most certainly not about the widespread racism that dominates the policing agenda in London and has done so for decades. Not just in London, but in the case of Girpal Vardi, it was the Metropolitan Police, the London Metropolitan Police. So we're talking about London for that reason. So Private Lie, contrary to the claims by Ian Pissoff that it is the best-selling magazine and all the other things and only investigative magazine, it is not any of those things. The reason why it is better selling than the others is because the others are so much worse. The fact that the others are so much worse than Private Lie doesn't make Private Lie better. And it is not doing the auditing of the parliament, it is not doing the auditing of the government at all. So Private Lie is running on a series of fantasies and pretensions, claiming to be not part of Fleet Street, which it isn't, because it's not a daily, it's a fortnightly. It comes out every 2 weeks, once every 2 weeks. Whereas the Fleet Street titles come out every day, except the Financial Times and the I newspaper, which publish Saturday and Sunday editions together. The others are published every day, the edition being that they put the Sunday into the thing. For example, the Times has got a Sunday edition, which is the Sunday Times. The Boris Graph is a Sunday edition, which is the Sunday Boris Graph. The Daily Mail has got a Sunday edition, which is the Mail on Sunday. And the Guardian acquired the Observer. So the Observer serves as the Guardian on Sundays. What we are saying about the diagnosis of Fleet Street is actually not just the diagnosis of Fleet Street, diagnosis of the court system, the court's bureaucracy, diagnosis of the alternative so-called platform like Private Eye, and the diagnosis of the government, the parliament, and the mainstream media, the society. And that is, as we say, it's a fact. It's not a boast. It's not something that we need to make a boast about. We don't need to make any boast about anything. What we are saying is that this is the only broadcast, it's the only channel, it's the only kind of publication online that deals with the Fleet Street and the media in this way. And the principles that we apply in diagnosing is solidly based on evidence, objective, independent, internationally objective evidence base. So you can extrapolate the same principles and apply these principles to looking at the role and the contents and the narrative followed by the counterparts in the USA. For example, there are two areas. One is Los Angeles and the other is New York. Most of the titles appear in terms of national kind of distribution from Los Angeles and New York, not from Washington, where a very small number of titles are based. So, and the same principles can also be applied to France, to Germany, and to other parts of the Western European kind of part of the continent. In fact, talking about Turkey, when we shall look not now, but we shall look later, another time, another date, or on several dates in the future. We shall be taking looks at the Turkish newspapers, or newspapers Turkish from Ankara and other parts of Turkey. And we shall do the same with the case of the Iranian publications. And we shall be looking, as we said yesterday, extensively at the papers in India. And we shall take it to Pakistan and to Bangladesh. And it is a prospect that we dread, because none of the countries in the subcontinent of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh is there an investigative media. Not at all. Which is dreadful, absolutely dreadful. And it is costing lives. It is destroying lives. It is ruining people's rights and it is denying people's rights. Happening in India, happening in Pakistan, happening in Bangladesh. So what we have to do is to look for indications of what is available to give people the platform, the say, to seek justice of some sort. And there is nothing in offing. There is nothing that is visible as coming in the near future, near next year or next decade, or in the decades to come. Which is why when we prepared the analysis, diagnosis of the Indian press or the printed media, main media in India, we decided to look at the Indian films, Bollywood, Tollywood, and the rest of Indian kind of films, cinema. And what we have found, or what we have been finding in the contents of the cinemas, is really frightening, really worrying. It is treating the supposed market, the audience, with contempt. It's worse than a factory production line. Factory production line of cinema. It makes no difference whether the production place is Bombay or Mumbai, or it's Madras or Chennai, or it's Hyderabad or Calcutta or any other city, or in Delhi. It doesn't matter. The cinema production line across India, or in the Indian cinema industry, is the same, identical. And there are not more than 100 currently kind of signed up actors. They are kind of interchanged and they are transferred from one role to the other. There are some villains or some roles of villains that are played by certain identifiable faces. But in other productions, the so-called blockbusters, the same actors take on the roles of the saints and the persons doing good and opposing corruption and criminality and gangsterism and don kind of domination by dons and crooks. But essentially, the cinema industry in India is doing severe disservice to the people of India and wasting very important time and opportunities. Because the actors that are used, many of them are abused and misused, of course. But the actors that are used essentially, or employed or engaged or kind of commissioned, many of them are very talented with potential for doing very good cinema, very good acting and very good role playing. But they're not getting the scripts that they deserve, and the scripts that, most importantly, the audience, the people of India essentially deserve. Why is that? Why is that happening? Why are Indian cinemas stuffed full of factory production, factory produced blockbusters and their likes? Why shouldn't there be intelligent, rigorous, and truthful, revealing, socially really revolutionary, liberating contents and scripts? What is holding them back? Most of the credit lines on the blockbusters acknowledge thanks to several companies and persons, which can only be about money that they get donated to the production of this particular film or that particular film, which is understandable, which is acceptable in terms of transparency. But should this process be as repetitive, as ominously repetitive as it has been growingly, evidently becoming for the last 30 years or so? Coincidentally, most of the actors, not all of them, most of the actors, let's say, being given leading roles or leading parts, both male and female, appear to be about 30 years old or in their 30s, or in their late 20s, or in the mid 20s, late 20s, or their mid 30s up to that time. Are they being given the opportunities that they could actually use to make their marks in playing significant roles, memorable roles, for liberating and entertaining at the same time? We shall be looking at those questions and those issues and the evidence. Both in India, because the number is so great, it's 1,200 million or 1,300 million people, or even maybe 1,400 million people in India. Whereas in Pakistan, it's, let's say, 250. I'm not looking at the statistics now of either countries. And in Bangladesh, the same or similar number. Altogether, just under, let's say, in the subcontinent, including Sri Lanka and Nepal and other kind of smaller countries, there are about 2 billion people, 2,000 million people. It's a huge part of the population of the world. Are they getting the service that they deserve? From their media, from their cinema, from their governments? These are the questions that deserve to be asked and explored and examined for the sakes of all these people. And we have not even started to investigate why the media and the governments and the academies, the universities, the education kind of bureaucracies are lagging behind in looking at the environment, looking at the sanctity of the environment and the rights of the creatures, the animals, and the habitats, and the countrysides, and the billions of trees and plants being destroyed across the subcontinent, and the absence of replanting trees and greening the subcontinent is not happening. And the question is, why? Who has kind of sabotaged the brains of these people who are doing various decisions at every level across the subcontinent, across the three main countries? Well, we include Nepal as well, but for various linguistic, cultural, and historic reasons, Nepal is slightly out of the range, but it is part of the frame, overall frame. And why is nobody stopping the destruction of the Everest mountains, of the range of hills? Why are these hills being climbed? Shir nehari amari, noto shir oi shikor himadrir. Now, who is lowering? Who is lowering the peak of the abode of ice? Did Nazrul, the rebel poet, who is the national poet registered of Bangladesh, did he speak in irony in that poem? Bolo bir, bolo unnoto mamo shir, shir nehari amari, noto shir oi shikor himadrir. Did he say those words in irony, or did he speak them literally from the heart? Could be both. But whoever is destroying the peak of the abode of ice is destroying the whole place, not just the little mountains that are being created under the big mountain that is being mountains that are being destroyed, but the whole plains of the subcontinent being destroyed. Did Nazrul raise the alarm in that poem, The Rebel? Bolo bir, bolo unnoto mamo shir, shir nehari amari, noto shir oi shikor himadrir.